The 2010 Chairman's Award of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture is presented to Professor Oleg Grabar.
Awarded the Chairman's Award of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, Oleg Grabar, Professor Emeritus of the School of Historical Studies at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and Aga Khan Professor Emeritus at Harvard University, sadly passed away on January 8, 2011. Grabar transformed the fields of Islamic art, architecture and archaeology through his research, lecturing and writing, inspiring many generations of undergraduate and graduate students. Only a few months prior to his death, the Aga Khan Award for Architecture held a discussion with Professor Oleg Grabar and 3 of his former students. This film, presented in 3 parts, is the record of that event.
I can't think of another scholar that's had a more important impact over generations on the study of Islamic art and architecture than Oleg Grabar.
The Chairman's Award of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture was created in 1980 to recognize lifetime achievement. It focuses on the contribution of individuals to the creation and understanding of the built environment in Muslim societies. The 2010 Chairman's Award has been bestowed to Professor Oleg Grabar, the Professor Emeritus of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Since its inception, only 3 other individuals have received this award. Oleg Grabar's research has had for many a profound and far-reaching influence on the study of Islamic art and architecture. His extensive archaeological expeditions and research trips covered the vast expanse of the Islamic world in Africa, the Middle East and Muslim Asia. He holds a PhD from Princeton University, and for some 15 years he was the Aga Khan Professor of Islamic Art at Harvard University. Today we are at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, where we gathered with some of the Aga Khan Award's close associates who all happen to be his former students. Mohammed Al-Assad is the founder and chairman of the Center for Study of Built Environment in Amman. He served as project reviewer for the Aga Khan Award for Architecture since 1989 and is also now a member of the award steering committee. Glenn Lowry, the director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Glenn has also been a member of the steering committee of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture since 2002. Renata Hollett is Professor of History of Art and Curator of the Near East section of the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. Renata was the first convener of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, my predecessor. My name is Farrokh Darakhshani and I'm the Director of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. And welcome to you all. Professor Grabar, who is the real Oleg Grabar?
Well, it's difficult for me to explain who I am, but I suppose from the point of view of this occasion, the important thing to know is that I started preparing myself some 70 years ago during the war in Europe, being brought up in a family of academics. My father was a celebrated professor, my mother was a doctor, my uncle was a chemist, my aunt was a doctor. In other words, academics surrounded me my whole life. And what I began by being fascinated by is foreign lands. When I was 13 or so, I bought in Paris on the quays a book on how to learn Chinese in 50 lessons. And I started learning Chinese. That didn't go very far. And very rapidly I switched from a Chinese to a language with an alphabet. And so there came my interest for the Near and Middle East, which began with the languages and traveling there. The reading of travel accounts. Before I had gone any place outside of Paris or so, I already had traveled through Central Asia, through Iran, through Africa, through all these countries. It's a constant passion for traveling. And I still read travel books with great interest, because they tell you both about the lands in which you are, but they also tell about yourself. And this interest was eventually transformed into what was the correct attitude in those days, the learning of languages. I started with Arabic, having had the obvious Greek and Latin that everybody had in my time. I forgot the Greek by now, but the Latin still exists somewhat. But you start with language, so for me it was Arabic, which I started first in Paris, then at Harvard, and then went on to other languages little by little. Eventually, I ended up as a graduate student in history, in Near Eastern history. And there, the teaching of that history was so bad when I was taking it, so completely, it was just not interesting. And if you read any of the history manuals written at that time, you would be bored too. They are hopeless. But fortunately, Princeton University at the time had a first-rate art history department. And there I moved little by little from history to art history. And there were trained by some truly first-rate minds about material culture, the arts, how it works, and so forth. And then I was lucky enough to receive a fellowship to spend a year in Jerusalem as a fellow of the American Schools of Oriental Research. And that was my first encounter with Jerusalem, which became very important in the rest of my life. And from there, I was hired, again, in a kind of remarkable old times, I was hired sight unseen by the University of Michigan as an instructor because I hadn't finished my PhD, and went to the University of Michigan, which then eventually, where I stayed 15 years, and that sort of created me. From there, I started to excavate, to develop the first groups of students, and in general, develop this kind of double interest that I've always said. On the one hand, archaeology, excavations, architectural monuments, especially of the early Islamic period, and then Persian painting and representations and illustrations in mostly Persian art. I mean, related art as well, but mostly Persian art. And this was kind of, for a long time, the two poles of my professional intellectual activity, including the time when I went to Harvard in 1969. And so that's essentially how I was created, so to speak, until my encounter with Aga Khan, which I think was very important.
So, can you tell us a little bit about how come you became associated with the Aga Khan Award for Architecture? Because you were one of the founders of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture.
Well, this is actually an amusing story because Aga Khan and I had never heard of each other at that time. Maybe I'd heard of him, but I'm not even sure about that, but he certainly had never heard of me. But through a fascinating system in which architectural firms operate by friends of friends who know friends of friends, Bill Porter, who was at that time Dean of the School of Architecture at MIT, and I were invited by a fellow architect in a big Boston firm to meet with that architect who happened to have been working for the Aga Khan, for the gardens of the Aga Khan near Paris. And then we were flown to Paris and met with the Aga Khan. And this was very interesting because he knew he wanted to do something. He wanted to do something for the Islamic world, for architecture, for building, for beautiful settings and so on. But we did not pay much attention to the Islamic world. It was not our concern, to the contemporary world. And here his interest in the contemporary world and our competences in doing things and our curiosity sort of gathered together. And from this started the award process, which we began in, I always forget the year, it was 77 or something.
1977.
1977. Began, and that process began there and continued ever since. Now, what was stunning is the profound desire of the Aga Khan to do something. And then we started developing all kinds of projects. Professor Holland became the convener of the award. And one of the episodes that I still remember with remarkable pleasure when Professor Holland had arranged the first gathering of nominations. We all met in Philadelphia to do a kind of test survey of candidates for the prizes. And we all, like little children, being given a toy. And I remember all of us were running from one room to another. Have you seen this one? Have you seen that one? Is that important? Is that not important? But it was very clear that we're all excited by the idea of judging something which had not been seen before, which people had not looked at or not looked seriously. And that, to me, is still one of the great characteristics of the Aga Khan Award and what it has done. It has discovered a world which has changed enormously since then, and this is another thing we can come back to. But it's not at all what it was in the late 70s. But at that time, it was something which was new, exciting, and full of a kind of fun. Everything was fun. Now, maybe it was also because I was only 40 then, and everything was more fun then than it would be now. But everything was fun, especially the traveling. It was exciting and very successful in its accomplishments.
Oleg, I'm interested in the way in which your engagement with the Aga Khan and the award might have changed the kinds of questions that you were interested in. You were trained as an archaeologist and a historian, and now you're dealing with contemporary societies and culture. What kind of impact did that have?
Well, it had double impact. One impact was a question, which was, does the contemporary world owe anything to the past? Or is the contemporary world responsible for the past? Or is what happened today, should it pay accounts to the past? In other words, are there traditions you have to maintain and so on? And I think initially, all of us felt a little bit that way, that the problem was that contemporary activities in the arts and in many other things were betraying a rich past. So our job was to rediscover that rich past, get everybody worked up about it. And we have all changed a great deal on that score. But at that time it was that. So this is one in which the past became a model, and which still is used sometimes by some extremist or fundamentalist groups and so forth. But the other side is that, and maybe retrospectively I feel very stupid having to say that, I never thought that people went to buildings. I always saw buildings as stones and decoration and this, but it never occurred that people go there. They pray there, they teach there, they talk there, they make deals. I mean, all kinds of things happen in buildings. And this kind of transformation, the contemporary uses of buildings made me try to understand better old buildings, that people make buildings. And buildings by themselves, they are interesting, but it's like going to, I don't know, pastry shop and seeing the beautiful cakes. If you don't eat them, there is no point in those beautiful cakes. So now, every time I visit a building, I first look at the people who are there. What do they do? How they're dressed? What do they do? Do they talk to each other? And this, again, is being totally revolutionized today by digital cameras. Now they come and take pictures of each other, which never happened before. So that every building you go to, from museum to churches to mosques to whatever it is, you have thousands of pictures being taken, a recording of buildings through the pictures of individuals. It's going to create havoc with my successors as scholars because they'll have so much information they'll never know what to do with it. But the point, however, is the discovery that the uses of buildings by people is something one has to deal with.
To build on that, I want to go back to your early encounters with the Islamic world. When did the first visit to the Islamic world take place? But I also want to ask another question. Do you recall from that visit more encounters with people or encounters with monuments and buildings?
That was, I would say, it's a complicated answer. The first encounter took place in September 1953, when my wife and I landed in Beirut by boat, and we were going to Jerusalem, so we had to go to Damascus, Amman, to go to Jerusalem. And we didn't have much money, but we had no idea what was going on. And the first thing that I do remember is seeing ads in the streets of Beirut that made me feel, I didn't know the Lebanese knew Persian, because there were bottles And on these bottles, there was writing, which I read as Farish Ab. That is a fresh up, you see, fresh up written in Arabic letters, Ab meaning water in Persian. So I thought it was so I immediately confused things on a physically correct reality. And so after my Farish Ab experience, we went to Damascus, and there come the second experience, which is not people, which was camels. The first discovery of camels in the Bekaa Valley. I mean, I knew that camels existed, but I'd never seen them, probably in zoos, but I've never seen camels in reality, in the street, in the outside. And it was spectacular. I mean, I've become fanatic lover of camels almost ever since. But then the arrival in Jerusalem was again buildings. I don't think I'll ever forget that late afternoon, it was quite late in the afternoon, ride from the Jordan River up towards Jerusalem. The road was still the old road that, and you suddenly turned the mountain, and here is the Dome of the Rock in front of you. Now, the Dome of the Rock was falling apart. It was in very bad shape, but the sight of that city with that old building was stunning, and that has remained with me ever since. I mean, so in other words, I think that there was a kind of people and and spaces. I would say spaces dominated in early times. Spend more time reading books and texts than talking to people. Later, maybe people became more important. I don't know. It's difficult to evaluate that. But
so on Jerusalem, you started your career working on Jerusalem, and then you went off and did other things, Iran, what have you. And just recently, you've come back to it. How do you take it now?
Well, it is simply something, whether you're Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim, that city is important to you. How you judge it, what you do it is another story. So, and every time I went there, I felt another level of that city, physical city appearing, because it has the extraordinary advantage of being built in such a way that it can almost not be changed. You can be around it, but you cannot change the basic rectangle. You always felt there that you suddenly enter into another time, and something else is there. And that helped understand other times in other places. But the parallel reason which came, or parallel impression which came later in life, is that everybody knows that Dome of the Rock is a beautiful building. It has been restored, it has gold on top, everything has been redone. And then I realized, and this is important for architecture, that nothing in the Dome of the Rock is of the 7th century. Everything has been done in the 20th century. The outside, the decoration, the ceiling, the mosaics are partly old, but they've been very much repaired. And yet everybody considers this to be a building built in 691. And so the question is, does it matter if something is modified by contemporary technology, changes and so forth? Is it a building of the 7th century or is it a building of the 21st century? And that poses very interesting intellectual problems because in a way it is the same problem as with icons as opposed to works of art. An icon can be reproduced, and it's always an icon. It plays the same holy role, whatever it is. A work of art is only one. And you cannot repaint the Mona Lisa endlessly, and it is no longer the Mona Lisa then. So someplace there is an interesting difference, which I haven't worked out theoretically, between things which are eternally the same, regardless of the time when they are put in the shape in which you see them, and things on the contrary which change all the time, and to which you have to adapt yourself. And this is certainly true with buildings. When is a building something that changes all the time? That's a good building because it's useful. If you have to remain the same, it could be a work of pure genius that somebody figured out all the possible needs of a building over the next generation, but this is very unlikely to happen.
So this is why you were attracted to studying the Mosque of Isfahan?
Well, that's
well, I mean, in a way, it builds up
in a
to
part
it.
also, yes, it is. The Mosque Isfahan is much more complicated, though the Rock is simple, it's a simple build. Mosque Isfahan is much more complicated, but they also, because it is, and Alhambra, I mean, those are buildings on which I've read quite a bit. Those are all buildings which are both interesting in the aesthetic impression they give, in the pleasure you get out of seeing them, and the interest you get with the domes of Isfahan and things of that nature. But they are also interesting because they all had different histories. And what the Alhambra is now, it is a tourist trap now. It is no longer a work of art. It is a tourist trap to which busloads come, deposit 10 minutes, only allowed 10 minutes because otherwise they don't have time for everybody else. Mosque of Isfahan is supposed to be a place of prayer. I have seen people praying there, but I've never seen the whole mosque used for prayer. It is a building which is totally unexpected and yet fascinating. You can spend hours there, and I was lucky enough in the 60s to spend 2 days on the roof, looking at all the domes from the roof. And I was all by myself with a camera. I mean, it was absolutely fabulous. You feel the whole building there. But I never understood, I still don't understand, how it was used. I mean, it's how it was used as a mosque, how it was used as anything, except a powerful statement by a series of rulers about their power.
That leads, I think, interestingly, to the contemporary scene, where you've studied monuments that were essentially the result, for the most part, of some form of royal patronage, or at the very least, a very privileged kind of patronage. Today we're seeing cities built where many of the buildings are commercial, where that same kind of structure certainly doesn't exist. And I wonder, as you look at the contemporary scene and what's happening, what's your response to it?
Well, this is it's very tricky because obviously my response changes all the time, because I only kind of started thinking about it. But to take the extreme new example, the new cities in the Gulf, one can say they are all arbitrary, artificial creations that nobody wanted there, that are built to show off the power and so on of a ruler, One can also say they exactly correspond to what our contemporary world is. We all live like that. We don't go, except for some oddballs, to old quarters to redo. We all like expensive stuff, new stuff, fancy stuff, and so forth. That, in other words, the modern world expresses, the modern world in the Islamic world expresses a universal human needs rather than peculiar human needs to the Muslim society.
Thank you, Professor Grabar. Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Renata, and thank you all for being here.